Good evening, everybody. It's great having you with us. We are going to be at Luke chapter 20, the first few verses. We're going all the way from Luke chapter 20, verses 1, all the way to verse 26. I invite you to turn there with me. Luke 20. Excuse me, I said Luke 21. It's Luke 20. So that's where we're going to be today. Today, we're going to talk about again, we're continuing Jesus' time in Jerusalem before his crucifixion. We're now to his last week. And we're going to talk about today about how the Pharisees really had their last shot, so to speak, at questioning Jesus, dealing with Jesus, and we'll see what the fallout of that was about. And so in Luke chapter 20, in verse 1, you get this very interesting section of Jesus' life. And from a personal point of view, this is one of my favorite accounts of Jesus working at the temple. Watch what happens here. In Luke chapter 20, verse 1, it says, "One day as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and scribes with the elders came up and said to him, 'Tell us by what authority you do these things, or who it is that gave you this authority.' He answered them, 'I will also ask you a question. Now, tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?' And they discussed it with one another, saying, 'If we say from heaven, he will say, why did you not believe him? But if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet.' So they answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, 'Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things.'" I love this section because this is an opportunity in which Jesus' adversaries, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they were able to have all their questions answered that they wanted to ask Jesus. All they had to do was to make a choice themselves. Let's look at what happened here. After Jesus drives out all the shady people in the temple, Jesus goes back and preaches the gospel to the crowds. Now, remember this because it's going to come into play later. Jesus is not hiding. Now, again, a little fast forward here. If you're familiar with the story of Jesus, how was Jesus arrested? Jesus was arrested at night, in the middle of the night, in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's not like Jesus was hiding himself. Jesus was in the open. Jesus was teaching at the temple. Uh, it's one of those times in which the people who arrested Jesus, the question has to get asked: why didn't you just grab him in the daytime when he's out in the open? Well, that's not because that's not how they wanted to do it. They wanted to catch him unawares, so to speak. But again, side note: Jesus isn't hiding himself. Now, those in charge want to know by whose authority Jesus teaches and causes havoc at the temple. And again, you think about Jesus' time at Jerusalem since he's come back to town. He's trashing the temple and he's teaching the people in the temple. Okay, who says you can do this? What authority can you do this? And this has been a big question that Jesus' adversaries have had for Jesus throughout the 3 years of Jesus' ministry. They don't understand Jesus' authority. Jesus will speak to them like nobody else speaks to them. But also, Jesus will perform miracles. Jesus will perform signs. Jesus cast out demons. Jesus will raise the dead. Jesus does all these things. And one just doesn't do all this kind of stuff without having some sort of authority. So the question is, where does Jesus get his authority? It's not about magic words or incantations. They understand that there has to be an authority that Jesus represents. They want to know what that authority is. Who does Jesus think he is to be able to do the things that Jesus does? Okay. But Jesus being Jesus, Jesus wants them to think. So he poses a challenge in return. He says, "I will ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?" Now, Luke doesn't go into it as much as Matthew, but the connotation here is that if you answer my question about John's baptism, then I'll answer your questions. But if you don't answer my questions, I'm not going to answer your questions. So all that the Pharisees need to do, all that the teachers of the law and everybody need to do is to answer the question. And so they discuss it amongst themselves, all right, because they feel like they only got one shot. And so this is what they come up with. If they answer from heaven, then then they feel like Jesus would say to them, okay, fine. John's baptism came from heaven, so then why didn't you believe John? Now, if you remember the story of John the Baptist, particularly out of the Gospel of John, which has a little bit more detail, Jerusalem, teachers of the law, they were curious about John, and they would send people out to investigate about John. And John, as we know, told them from the get-go, he's not the Messiah. But apparently, as time went on, they didn't believe much about John. And so that's what they feel like would be Jesus' answer back. But if they answer that the baptism came from man, they don't want to say that. Even if they might believe it, they don't want to say it because the people, the masses, believe that John was a prophet, and the people would get angry and stone them to death. Okay, so they feel like they can't do either. And so they then say, we don't know. Now, these are supposed to be religiously the most intelligent people in the room, and they're going to tell Jesus, we don't know. I remember when I was taking Greek, and I got through that with a hope and a prayer. Let's just say C stands for complete. But we would have that teacher there, and I struggle with foreign language, and Greek was just a step above. At least Spanish, the letters looked the same. Greek was a totally different animal altogether. Our teacher asked us a question, called me out, and said, "What does such and such phrase mean?" And I had looked him right in the eye, and this is the guy who's been teaching me for Greek for a couple of months. And at that time, I still was ashamed, but I couldn't think of anything. So I just told him, I said, sir, I have no idea what that means. It was the truth, and I hated to admit it. But I've only been taking Greek for a couple of months, so so I guess it is what it is. These guys are supposed to be people who have been students of the law of Moses since they were boys, right? They're supposed to be, again, the smartest people in the room. And yet they're going to tell Jesus, we don't know. They got no shot at all. And it's sad. Now, but you go back to what Jesus' first issue was. He told them, I'll ask you a question. Now tell me. Now, notice that Jesus did not say that they had to answer the question correctly. Just answer it. Was John's baptism from heaven or from man? Just answer the question. Take a stand. What do you think? He didn't say you had to be right for me to then answer your questions. He just told them, answer it. So it's like, well, what does that mean? Well, basically, stop being politicians. Stop being people who are trying to play a game and make a stand, make a choice on something that you believe in. Now, this is important, especially if you compare it to all the shady behavior that goes into them having Jesus killed. Again, humanity showed their evil side when they put Jesus on the cross because of all the shenanigans that went on in order to have that done. And so they answer, they don't know. In other words, they refused to answer. They knew. They felt something, but they felt like they couldn't answer. That answering this question was not worth the price that it would cost. So Jesus refuses to answer their question. And maybe it's, to me, again, I love this section. It's not a complicated section, so it's a simple little section. But the thing is that we cannot grow if we are not willing to admit where we are. Again, the teachers of the law and the scribes, they had the shot to be able to ask Jesus anything they wanted to, and Jesus Again, Matthew bears this out more. Jesus tells them, I will answer your questions if you just answer this one question of mine, but they refuse to do it. They miss out on their own opportunity to get to know Jesus closer because they refuse to answer just a little question from Jesus. They weren't willing to risk it. We cannot grow without risk, is one, and also pride kept them from all their answers. And so they miss out. It's sad. It really is a sad state of affairs, but it is what it is. And so he takes that vibe and he applies it to a parable. He tells them the parable of the wicked tenants. And here's what it is. He says in verse 9, and he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. And when the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And they sent yet a third. This one also they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, what shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, this is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours. And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and gave the vineyard to others. Okay, let's just stop there. Jesus launches into a parable about how the Jewish leadership are missing the Messiah. And it's actually a history lesson to show how their ancestors also ignored those whom God sent to them. The vineyard is planted by the owner and rented out, or the nation is planted by God and given to the Jews to work. God giving them the promised land, God creating the nation, God sending the nation on the mission. You know, again, this sometimes get missed, but the Jewish nation had a purpose besides just taking occupancy of the promised land. The rest of the world was supposed to learn about God through God's relationship with the Jews. And the Jews, on the whole, there were some moments of brilliance, but the Jews on the whole didn't take that role seriously. So the tenants did not want to give the owner the cut of the produce. So this is what would happen back in the day. You would have a landowner, and he would rent out the land to farmers and whatnot to work. And the way that the landowner got paid was through a percentage of the produce given to the landowner. So that's the context that Jesus puts this parable. The owner sent servants to get what was owed, but the servants were beaten. Or God sent his prophets to try to get the nation of Israel's attention, but were instead abused. You know, in the parable, this happens a few times. In the Old Testament, this happened numerous times too, that the followers of God, the prophets of God, being a prophet back in Old Testament times was a risky business. You were not popular, you were not liked, and your life could be in danger. People would try to kill you for being God's messenger. You would be called crazy. You would be called things like terror on every side. You would be imprisoned. And this happened a lot. You could even be killed. Prophets were killed. But what were the prophets? The prophets were God's attempts in order to get the nation of Israel's attention before they lost the land. In the parable setting, this is told by servants trying to get the master's cut. Okay, so again, it didn't work. So the owner of the vineyard said to himself, what shall I do? I'll send my son. And this is where the past comes to meet the present, the context of the parable. The owner sends his son, who is later dragged outside and killed, or God sends Jesus, who is later killed. Now, again, Jesus' death on the cross is their future, our past, but that's what it was leading to. And this is, again, Jesus predicting his death before it happened. And so what do we have here? We have here then also that they threw him out and they killed him. Now Jesus asks a question. What will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to the others. Now see, this is interesting situation with Jesus' death on the cross. Again, Jesus' death on the cross was a prophesied event and it had to happen. If we're going to have salvation, Jesus had to die on that cross. But again, as we've talked about, you look at some of the shady behavior, the shenanigans that the Jews would do in order to have Jesus killed. Let's not forget that the number of prophets that were killed by the Jews' hands. Was God happy with the nation of Israel? And the answer would be no. Because the nation of Israel had abused their responsibility, not fulfilled their end of the bargain. You can even see this going forward in the book of Acts, going forward into the New Testament, into the book of Acts and beyond, where you get the wonderful story of Peter working with the family of Cornelius, the centurion, baptizing that entire family, making the first Roman converts. And the first thing that Peter has to do when he gets back home is to defend what he did to other Jews. You also look at situations where Jews would go into Gentile churches and Gentile areas and try to teach them that if you want to be a Christian, you got to follow the law of Moses, follow the dietary law, and everything else. Basically, follow the law of Moses. You got to be a Jew if you want to be a Christian. And unfortunately, you're seeing stuff like this happen today. There's a thing going around these days called the Jewish Roots movement, where everybody's trying to take the worship of God from a New Testament perspective and try to turn it all Jewish. In order to understand Jesus, you have to understand Judaism. Okay, it helps to understand some things about sacrificial system and things like this. Yeah, that can help paint a better picture. But do we need to reinstate, have the idea that I have to worship on Saturday, on the Sabbath, that I have to do all this and look at things from a Jewish bent so that I can understand the Bible more? Absolutely not. The Old Testament was leading into the New Testament. And I don't have time here to quote you all the scriptures about that, but just a good block to go to, read the book of Hebrews. And that's one of the points of that entire book. I don't want to go back to the old system when I've been given something better. But again, they missed it. And it's sad that they missed it and they missed their opportunity. But that gets us back to the question, what do they expect the owner of the vineyard to do? What do we expect God to do when the people have not done what they're supposed to do? Well, in AD 70, Jerusalem's going to get sacked by the Romans, and the precious temple that the Jews put so much stake in is going to be completely decimated, where no stone is lying on top of another. It's going to be done. The Romans do it, but it was an act of God. Now, let's talk about the reaction. When they heard this, they said, "Surely not." But he looked directly at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush them." There's some deep stuff here. Now, the Jews got this one. They're going to get cranky. They're going to get upset that Jesus is speaking against them because they realize that Jesus is speaking against them. And they say, "Surely not. God's not going to do anything to us. The owner's not going to do anything to us. What are you talking about?" And so what does Jesus do? Jesus goes all the way back into their precious Old Testament, and he pulls up Psalm 118:22, which is the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. It was part of the prophecy of the Messiah that the Messiah was going to be rejected. He was going to be rejected. Why? Because people don't put to death people that they like. Jesus had to be hated in order to be crucified. And so they're going to reject them. God didn't wire them that way. They're going to do it because of their own human nature. But Jesus goes past that, and knows how Jesus does it. He looks directly at them. Jesus knew what was coming, and he was not intimidated by these men who are going to try to orchestrate it. And he tells them, "Everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces." Well, who's the stone? He's the stone. Sometimes Peter gets called a stone in our Catholic circles because of the great confession that Peter made, calling Jesus the Christ for the first time, being the first of the disciples to do so. And Jesus turns to him and says, "And upon this rock I will build my church." Now, Peter comes from the Greek word meaning, Petros, meaning rock. Hey, I got that one. And they think, well, the church was built on Peter. No, The church was built on Peter's confession. What was Peter's confession? That Jesus is the Christ. That's the rock. That's the cornerstone. And so Jesus now says, everyone who falls on that stone, on that identity that Jesus is the Christ, will be broken to pieces. He then goes on to say, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Jesus is now a couple of days away from being killed on a cross. But the reality is that if anybody goes to war against the Messiah, they are going to lose. Remember the Messiah that we put all of our hope in. It's not the Jesus of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's not even the resurrected Jesus that we see at the end of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Jesus that we're supposed to put our hope in is the Jesus of the book of Revelation, with the sword coming out of his mouth, with the legs like burnished bronze, with the eyes like fire, and all of that. Riding the white horse, as a true king. Jesus and his heavenly power. That is the Messiah that we put our faith in. That's the Messiah of power and glory. We have to remember that when Christ is coming back, he's not coming back as the carpenter teacher. He's coming back as the conquering hero. He's coming back as a conqueror. This is what he is, and that's how come he's going to look these people in the eye and not blink, and to tell them this stuff. You try to go up against the Messiah, you will lose. You fall on top of him, you'll be shattered. If the rock falls on you, you will be crushed. This is where the power lies, in the power of the stone, the precious cornerstone that they rejected. But just because people reject the cornerstone, and people still reject the cornerstone today, Gentile or Jewish, he's being rejected. But just because man chooses to reject the cornerstone does not take the power of Jesus away. Because that still doesn't take away from the fact that one day every knee shall bow and every tongue will confess, regardless if they say they believed in Jesus or not. And the truth is, in my personal belief, I believe that most people in the world who has heard of God has some sort of belief in God. Why do I say that? Well, why is it that people who are atheists or however they color themselves, people who don't believe in Jesus, why are they so angry? And why are they so desperate in order to try to take the name of Jesus away? Because if they can get it out of the way, they don't have to worry about it. But that's a misnomer, because you can't defeat it. And if they keep trying, they'll be shattered, they'll be crushed. One more for tonight. It's another one of those instances of which Jesus plays these people very easily. He starts talking to them about taxes. We all love tax season, don't we? It says in verse 19, it says, the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he told this parable against them. See, they got that one. But they feared the people. So they watched him, spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. Okay, so let's just think about this plan briefly, shall we? Now, this is Jesus now that has been able to perceive what's going on in their hearts. Now, they're desperate. This is a desperate attempt to get Jesus into trouble. And so their plan is, let's infiltrate his disciples with spies, like this is going to work. Do we think that Jesus can't sense a spy coming his way when he's been able to perceive what's going on in everybody's heart that's come around him? I mean, come on, he knew which of the disciples was going to betray him. He knew what was in the heart of the Pharisees when he healed the crippled man. Jesus knows these things, and this wasn't going to work either. Okay, so they try to butter him up with some false compliments. And again, it just doesn't work. In verse 21, it says, so they asked him, teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? See, they think they're so clever because this is supposed to be a question in which there is no safe answer. There's no winning in this question. It's a no-win situation. Okay, so the question again, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? Or is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar? Okay, if Jesus says, pay your taxes, then Jesus would lose the support of the Jews because the Jews hated paying taxes to Caesar. Now, again, this is assuming Jesus cared about having the Jews' support. All right, and if Jesus was wanting to keep favor, he wouldn't say this because the Jews would turn on him. The Jews paid their taxes, but they paid them begrudgingly. They didn't want to do it. All right. Now, contrariwise, if Jesus said, "Don't pay your taxes," then the Jews could turn Jesus into the Romans for insurrection. Because they would say, "Hey, this guy, he's speaking to the people, and he's telling the people not to pay their taxes. We don't believe such foolish thing, but this guy's saying it. You might want to do something about it." So again, they've given Jesus a yes or no question where the yes and the no has prices. Doesn't this sound familiar? Jesus just asked the Jews a question that only had two possible answers, and they failed miserably. Now, in turn, they're giving Jesus a question in which has two possible answers. And what does Jesus do? Jesus answers a third way. It says, he said to them, he says he perceived their craftiness and said, in other words, Jesus understands this is a setup job. They're not looking for true answers. They're trying to get him in trouble. So he says, hey, who has a coin? Who has a denarius? Let's see it. Now he gets a coin and he shows it to the people. And he says, whose likeness is on this denarius? Whose inscription does it have? And they said, Caesar. So Caesar's name is on the coin. And he said to them, render to Caesar's the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things are God. Render to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. In other words, give Caesar and give God what is owed to Caesar and owed to God. There's your answer. And it's so funny. Could I have come up with this answer off the top of my head? Probably not. I'll be honest to you. But am I the only one thinking? It's like, wow, it is a simple answer. But yet, like a lot of things that are simple, it's still filled with wisdom. And you're just like, wow, how could he come up with that? And the people who were with him on that day, they were agog with what Jesus said. They were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. That's the thing about Jesus and these guys. Jesus would teach us, and the apostles would teach us as well. That is that we are supposed to live such a life that the world's going to hate us, but the world doesn't understand why it hates us. The world is going to turn against us, but the world's also supposed to be confused and to think, why is it that I hate these people? Why is it that I wish these people harm? And in the same way that Jesus lived, Jesus did so much good in his life, but he was still vilely hated by his enemies. And even when Jesus does something like this, the people who were trying to get Jesus into trouble, let's say he got himself out of that one. But then also on the same other side of their head, they're like, man, that was very well done. And so they still had this respect for Jesus, even though they very much wanted to kill him. And again, that's just one of the interesting things about the life of Jesus. And they had nothing, and they were silent. Wisdom does not have to be complicated. Wisdom just has to be true. And being able to do some good thinking in order to reason this stuff out. That's all that Jesus did. It's possible to do. And the people hated him because he was able to get out of it, but still, they marveled at what he said. And so on this day, as we wrap up for today, The story is Jesus 3, teachers of the law and the Pharisees 0. They wouldn't answer, they couldn't, no, they could have answered, but they wouldn't answer Jesus' question. Jesus taught a parable against them, and also Jesus outsmarted them with the question about taxes. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the Sadducees as they get a turn, and we'll look at again another question that Jesus throws out at them, and another warning about Jesus, warning the people about people like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. I thank you all for joining me tonight. Blessings to you all. Grace and peace.